Here is Sailor Studio 473. This is a beautiful mid-tone of orange that from the chromatography, I expected a kind of neon pink. As in orange, it isn't too bright, being distracting or too much on the page. It can easily read a whole page of writing with this ink. And very often, orange can be a little overpowering in a whole page. Not here. As a mid-tone orange, there is no tone shift as the paper changes. It does shade, but only a little bit, and not as a standout feature of this ink. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it generally performs well with no feathering or spread or bleeding, making this a very friendly to cheap paper option. 20-pound standard exception may apply. Now, orange is my favorite second color on the page, and this is actually the second sample that I have as I burned through the first sample too fast to film the review, so I'm going to say this is definitely a good one.
The pen for today is a Pelikan M200. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
As I said, this is a very nice mid-tone orange, almost like a tangerine orange if I were to try to describe it as a something. It does not feather, does not spread, it does shade, and we see it quite regularly in some of the spots, like some. Starts darker on the S, during the O lightens up a lot, goes to a mid-tone with the M, darker again at the E. Take a look at integers, where it goes back and forth from darker to lighter to dark for a bit, light for just a little bit, and back to dark again. Mostly what we get is that mid-tone, but just a little bit of shading. So good. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and can easily continue writing back here.
Sailor makes more than one ink, so let's take a look at a few other inks from Sailor.
Here is Sailor Yonaga.
Here is Sailor Hagugate Gegon. Here is Sailor Mirai.
Here is Sailor Yozakura.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
We can see that what we get here is just about the same tone as the Clairfontaine, only a slight variation of it. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, does have little bits of shading for when you're looking for it. Take a look at 4 on the second line. The F is a little bit darker, works its way lighter into the OR at the end. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and can easily continue writing back here.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we can see we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does have just the tiniest bit of shading that you can find when you really want to go looking for it. Look at that 0 of the 10. Darker on the top, lighter on the bottom. This not having any kind of tone shift with the tone paper, really what that means for us is we've got an opaque ink, not affected by the tone of the paper that you're going to be writing on. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting. Great for continuing our notes here.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we can see we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does have just a little bit of shading, just as it has with some of the other ones, only when you're looking for it, like on only, starts a little darker at the bottom of the O, lightens into the N and beginning of L. The LY at the end is a bit darker. I think it stands out against the quad rule without any kind of major problems here. I do think if I was using a finer pen, then it might have sort of vanished into the background some. But that's not what's happening because of the broader nib. Looking at the back of the page, there is that one freaky point where it got a little bit deeper in there, and that's where I kind of paused in writing, held the nib in place. So I guess technically it could get deeper, though I'm not going to hold that against this ink. Otherwise, I'm going to say that there is no ghosting, no bleeding, and a great performance.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more orange inks.
Here is Califolio Aurora. Here is Geherban Orange Indian.
Here is Kaweco Sunrise Orange.
Here is Mont Blanc Ink of Joy.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is the same as the Clairfontaine, though it looks a little bit flatter as a tone. Does not feather, does not spread, barely shades. I'm going to say, much like many of the writing samples, it doesn't happen frequently. Look at frequently. It's only at the bottom of the Y that you see any of the shading. Otherwise, we just get that same flat, medium, flat orange tone. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Diatramentis Sigmund Freud Sapphire Blue. Here is Noodler's Whaleman Sepia. Here is KWZ Rotten Green.
Here is Noodler's Purple.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we can see that the tone is just a little bit lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, though. It does spread, which you should expect here. It does have some shading that goes on. I mean, just exactly what's happening in exactly. The spread and the shading are both occurring together. You see the X is a little bit darker than what's around it. Same with the Y at the end. But generally, don't use this in a double broad on this. A thinner nib. Absolutely, I think we've got a good use case here. Looking at the back of the page, you can see that it gets quite deep into the paper, a lot, even being a mid-tone orange. A lot of ghosting happening, so I would not write on the back of this page. However, none of it bled through touching the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The Pelikan M205 has a very wet double broad nib and holds a consistent tone across papers and has a little bit of shading. I was curious if the tone would hold with a medium flow fine nib, so that's what I tried off camera. It was just as kind of flat mid-tone light, but it did shade a little bit better. So very much that mid beautiful tone that we're getting, better shading. For me, I like the tone from the wet pen, and the double broad is just a little too much for taking additional notes. So I'm going to say go for that medium or fine, a wet fine or a medium fine. It's right in the sweet spot for this ink.